There are two questions. One has to do with providing support for defense against the invasion, which is certainly legitimate. The other is seeking ways to end the crime before even worse disasters arise. Now, that second part is not discussed in the West, barely discussed. Anyone who dares to discuss it is immediately subjected to a flood of invective and a hysterical condemnation. But if you're serious about Ukraine, there are two things you ask. One, what can we do to support Ukraine in defense against aggression? Second, how can we move to end the war before it leads to even worse destruction of Ukraine, more starvation worldwide, reversing the limited efforts to deal with global warming, possibly moving up an escalation ladder to war, the nuclear war. That's the second half uh, of the borrow a phrase attributed to Winston Churchill. Uh, there's a lot of war, but no joy. And there ought to be joy if you care about Ukraine and the rest of the world. Can it be done? We don't know. Official US policy is to reject a diplomatic settlement, to move to weaken Russia severely so that it cannot carry out further aggression, but not do anything on the jaw side, not think of how to bring the crimes and atrocities to an end. That's the second part of the question. So, yes, the US should continue with the kind of calibrated support that's been given. The Pentagon wisely has vetoed uh, uh, initiatives to go well beyond support for defense up to attack on Russia. So far, the Pentagon, which seems to be the dovish component in the US administration, has vetoed plans which very likely would lead on to nuclear war, which would destroy everything. So, calibrated provision of weapons to blunt the offensive, allow Ukraine to defend itself, if sensible, combined with efforts to see if something can be done to bring the crimes and atrocities to an end and avert the much worse consequences that are in store. That would be all. Instead, the US only dealing with the first. And all of our discussions limit themselves to the first in the United States and in Britain, not in Europe.
Do you worry about nuclear war in the 21st century? How do we avoid it?
Anyone who doesn't worry about nuclear war doesn't have a gray cell functioning. Of course, everyone is worried about nuclear war, or should be. It's very easy to see how steps could be taken, they've even been recommended, that would lead to nuclear war. So you can read articles, even by liberal commentators, who say we should drop all the pretenses, just go to war against Russia, they have to be destroyed. Uh, you can see proposals coming from Congress, uh, other leading figures, saying we should establish a no-fly zone. Pentagon objects. They point out correctly that to establish a no-fly zone, you have to have control of the air, which means destroying Russian air defense systems, which happen to be inside Russia. We don't know that Russia won't react. Even the call, now almost universal, to ensure that Ukraine wins, drives out all the Russians, drives them out of the country, sounds nice on paper, but notice the assumption. Uh, the assumption is that Vladimir Putin, this madman who just seeks power and is out of control, will sit there quietly, accept defeat, slink away, not use the military means that, of course, he has to destroy Ukraine. One of the interesting comments that came out in today's long article, I think Washington Post reviewing a lot of leaks from, actually, not leaks, actually presented by US intelligence and US leaders about the long build up to the war. And one of the points it made was surprise on the part of British and US leaders about Putin's strategy and his failure to fight the war the way the US and Britain would, with real shock and awe, destruction of communication facilities, of energy facilities, and so on. They can't understand why he hasn't done all that. Well, could. If you want to make it very likely that that'll happen, then insist on fighting until somehow Russia faces total defeat. Then it's a gamble, But if he's as crazy and insane as you claim, presumably will use weapons that he hasn't used yet to destroy Ukraine. So the West is taking an extraordinary gamble with the fate of Ukraine, gambling that the madman, lunatic, Mad Vlad won't use the weapons he has to destroy Ukraine and set the stage for escalation up the ladder, which might lead to nuclear war. It's quite a gamble.
How much propaganda is